The war that secretly bankrupted an empire, how Afghanistan destroyed the USSR. The helicopters beat the Salang Pass at dawn, rotors chewing thin air as a convoy below burned, diesel popping in the cold. In Moscow, a minister slid a column of numbers left. Another month balanced if you ignored the fuel that never arrived. One order could move thousands of rubles on paper, but not a single liter uphill. Soldiers traded rations for cash that couldn't buy parts. The ruble looked strong, deficits and IOUs curled under blotters. What they didn't see, the war wasn't just money, it was capacity bleeding out. To understand how that meter started running, we have to go back to the decision. The decision to intervene, a limited war with unlimited lines. They called it a limited contingent. The phrase did a lot of work. In late 1979, the Politburo weighed two fears at once: a volatile Afghanistan spilling Islamic activism into Soviet Central Asia, and the possibility that letting a client wobble would signal weakness across the bloc. The Brezhnev doctrine had a habit. Problems inside the socialist family were handled inside the family. This looked no different until it was. The plan seemed tidy. Insert advisors, steady Kabul, keep the economy on rhythm. No mobilization, no nationwide disruption. Trains would still run, factories would still meet quotas, and the new year would look like the last one, just with fewer headlines. The stakes felt abstract in that room: credibility, zones of influence, the map on the wall. The risk was concrete but distant, an open-ended commitment that could anchor the state to a mountainous sink. Intelligence painted a jittery picture. Hafizullah Amin had seized power, and paranoia ran hot. KGB reports warned that Kabul could pivot in unpredictable ways, threatening a border that Moscow treated like a firewall. The military staff built a template around speed and precision: airborne units to secure key nodes, a corridor from the north, advisors embedded to shape Afghan units. Call it a limited contingent, and you keep the word war out of the newspapers. On December 1979 nights, orders moved faster than freight. Transport aircraft queued, paratroopers buckled in, special rations issued with the quiet ceremony of routine. That's where the hidden cost centers got seeded without anyone naming them. Hazard pay isn't just an envelope. Once you promise it, it repeats every month. Airlift isn't just a flight. Every sortie burns airframe hours you can't replace at planned rates. A ration upgrade isn't lunch. It's a supply chain with refrigerated storage, packaging, and priority rail space that someone else now won't get. Once boots hit Afghan runways, the tale got real. Every kilogram forward required a string of decisions back through Tashkent, Orenburg, and depots that had never planned for mountain warfare at scale. A brigade on paper is numbers. A brigade in the Hindu Kush is fuel, tires, rotor blades, winter gear, medevac turns, and spare engines with workers assigned to overhaul them months from now. The order sounded simple. The supply geometry didn't. Meanwhile, the language inside Moscow stayed careful. Stabilization, assistance, fraternal duty. Limited meant budget lines could be reclassified rather than expanded. You'd tuck transport into existing ministry totals, shuffle maintenance to enterprise reserves, ask factories for one-time excess that somehow repeats. On paper, the rubles didn't spike. On rails, everything did. The human ledger started filling in the margins. Conscripts, mostly 19, received postings stamped special conditions. That label triggered hazard coefficients in peril offices and dedicated trains in dispatch yards. The decision-makers didn't dwell on it. Why would they? The war was supposed to be fast. That's how you keep the economy calm. You trade speed for shock. There was one problem. The terrain didn't care about slogans. Securing the Salang tunnel meant guarding a bottleneck you couldn't duplicate. Every convoy that squeezed through tied-up escorts, engineers, recovery vehicles, and medics, none of which had been limited in the planning slides. Ambush risk alters math. You don't move a truck, you move a system, and systems demand redundancy. Redundancy is cost. Inside ministries, quiet alarms blinked. Fuel allocations that had balanced by quarter now showed temporary overfulfillment. A euphemism, really. Trains that would have hauled machine parts to a factory in the Urals now waited for flat cars parked under helicopters at Churchill. To keep the plan limited, they didn't expand capacity, they reassigned it. Someone's production goal vanished so a battalion could get winter boots on time. A micro-story played out in every office. A finance officer, careful and proud, shifted a small fund labeled Special Operations to cover an airlift. He told himself it was a one-off. 2 months later, the line item was bigger, and the temporary transfer had a memo trail. Limited operations create permanent categories. Once they exist, they defend themselves. Meanwhile, the diplomatic clock ticked. The leadership understood optics. Keep the footprint tidy, sidestep a global backlash, signal reliability to allies. But reliability has a price. It demands predictable trains, steady pay, and the ability to surge when an Afghan garrison calls at midnight. Each promise became a claim against a system already running with little slack. This was the moment everything changed, not with a firefight, but with a procurement form. Aviation commanders requested increased Mi-24 sortie rates to compensate for ground constraints. That moved costs from fuel dumps to air depots, from truck tires to turbine blades. Airframes don't care about ideology, they care about cycles. Cycles are finite. Replace them, and you dip into factories already chasing last year's quotas. Don't replace them, and you accept rising risk and declining effectiveness. Back in the Politburo, updates came phrased as reassurance. Progress was incremental. Problems were being addressed. The words kept pace with expectation. But the country that thought in 5-year plans had taken a decision that rewrote this year's physics. The limited mission had unlimited lines attached. Logistics, pensions, subsidies, repairs. The IOUs nobody logged as war costs because the columns still added up. For a while. The first real bill didn't show up at the front. It arrived in the rail yards, where dispatchers bumped civilian freight for military priority and called it patriotic scheduling. It arrived in enterprises, where directors hit quotas by cannibalizing reserves they were supposed to save for breakdowns. It arrived in families, where a son's posting changed a mother's budget. The decision was done. The meter had started, and the numbers would only look clean until the shortages made them loud. Logistics is the war, fuel, rails, and the Salang bottleneck. While the decision sounded tidy in Moscow, the road south argued back. The Salang tunnel was the throat of the campaign, one narrow, concrete artery punched through ice and rock. Every liter of fuel meant for Kandahar first had to climb to that altitude, pulled by underpowered trucks straining in low gear, burning the same resource they were supposed to deliver. Quartermasters joked bitterly that fuel drank itself before it reached the front. It wasn't a joke. In mountain war, delivery costs multiply themselves. On paper, the route looked simple. Soviet rail to Termiz on the Amu Darya, barge across the river, offload to trucks, then up and over the Hindu Kush to the central plateau. In reality, each handoff was a wound. Rail schedules slipped, cranes broke, barges sat idle waiting for convoy escorts, and truck columns stacked up on the approach to Salang, engines idling, drivers listening for the pop of distant ambush fire. Railcars once counted in thousands suddenly felt scarce, because a flat car parked for helicopters at Churchik was a flat car that didn't carry bearings to a factory in Sverdlovsk. One bottleneck creates 10 more. Ruble prices hid the burn. The plan priced diesel as if it existed in a warehouse a block away, not a mountain range away. The numbers didn't know about blown tires on shale or rotor wash whipping dust into filters that clogged twice as fast. Opportunity cost. What didn't get moved because something else took priority didn't appear on the ledger. But it did appear on factory floors that waited for missing inputs, and in fields where harvest windows closed while grain sat in sidings labeled delay due to special load. Micro-stories made it human. A quartermaster in Kunduz signed for 12 tankers of fuel. Only 9 found the lot. 1 was siphoned along the road, rubber tubes and a dozen 5-liter cans disappearing into alleyways. Another burned in a ditch after a roadside blast. The last arrived with seals broken and the paperwork suspiciously perfect. He wrote it up as shrinkage and sent a runner to the motor pool begging for ration cuts that wouldn't stall the patrols. He slept next to the depot that night, a pistol under a blanket, knowing that the next report would accuse him of losing what the road had already stolen. Convoys moved like nervous animals. In the passes, a truck didn't travel alone. It needed an escort with machine guns, engineers to clear debris, a recovery vehicle for the inevitable breakdowns, medics at the rear. Multiply that by hundreds and the tail swayed the body. Each mile added more people to protect the fuel meant for those people. Meanwhile, Afghan fighters learned the rhythms, hit the lead truck, then the fuel, let the fear clog the route more effectively than any avalanche. Back in the rail yards, dispatchers stared at boards filled with magnets. Military priority meant red markers jumped ahead, civilian freight lost. Temporary rescheduling, they called it, but temporary has a way of extending itself when a war depends on a single tunnel. Railcar shortages crept outward. A chemical plant couldn't ship resin. A textile mill missed dye shipments. A collective farm's fertilizer arrived late, and yields dipped. Each delay flowed back to the same place, the mountain road, and the calculus that made it sacred. Factories began to cannibalize their own buffers. Directors who'd saved for a rainy quarter emptied stores to meet plan, then filed requests for replenishment that vanished into special allocations. Maintenance slipped because the lathes needed to make bearings were themselves awaiting bearings. The system leaned on slogans, overfulfillment, heroic transfers, language that disguised scarcity. Meanwhile, drivers on the Salang counted the minutes between rockfall and ambush, hoping the engine held temperature and the brakes didn't glaze. The ruble couldn't buy insurance against physics. Airlift helped, but every Mi-8, Mi-24 sortie that replaced a truck added hours to a maintenance log back in the USSR. Those hours didn't erase the tunnel, they just shifted strain from tires to turbines. When weather closed the passes, helicopters hauled pallets over white slopes, attendants throwing out ballast to clear the ridge, pilots landing dirty in thin air. The price wasn't paid in currency. It was paid in airframe fatigue, engine cycles, and the hidden labor of workers months away who'd strip down those engines and find stress they didn't plan for. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the river. Barges needed diesel too, and the depots feeding them faced their own shortages because trains had been diverted north for military loads. To protect the war route, the system thinned itself elsewhere. It worked, until it didn't. A drought on the steppe, a winter surge in heating demand, a breakdown at a refinery. Each normal fluctuation bit harder because capacity had been reassigned to keep the tunnel fed. Stakes stacked quietly. If the Salang slowed, garrisons rationed, patrols shrank, and the war shrank with them, or bled more to keep pace. To prevent that, the center accepted more disruption at home. The trade was invisible until a factory missed a delivery 3 times, and the director called the party secretary in fury. Then it became political. This was the truth the balance sheets couldn't show. Logistics wasn't a back office, it was the war. And every liter that crawled over the pass carried the weight of an empire's schedule on its back. The dollar war, hard currency, sanctions, and covert funding. While convoys crawled over the Salang, another battle unfolded in places without mountains, clearinghouses, credit committees, and ministries that dealt in dollars, not diesel. The Soviet Union could print rubles. It couldn't print hard currency. And the war demanded things the ruble couldn't command. Western grain when harvests ran short, precision bearings, specialized electronics, pipeline compressors, chemical catalysts. Those lived in catalogs priced in dollars and Deutschmarks. Suddenly, logistics had a second front. Washington moved early. After the 1979 invasion, the US grain embargo arrived with fanfare and loopholes. It wasn't airtight, other exporters stepped in, but it signaled something crucial. Access would tighten, terms would harden, and technology would get gated. COCOM lists lengthened. Orders that once slid through now stalled, while ministries drafted letters explaining why a computer-controlled milling machine was for civilian use. The answer came back slower, with stricter conditions and higher prices. Then oil turned from lifeline to knife. For years, the USSR sold crude and gas to Europe, recycling those earnings into imports that patched the plan. In the mid-1980s, Saudi production surged, prices fell, and the floor disappeared. Every dollar lost at the wellhead echoed in Gosplan. It wasn't politics, it was arithmetic. When barrels drop from 30 to the teens, balances shrink and the room to maneuver withers. The same pipeline miles, the same pumping stations, suddenly less money for the same work. Meanwhile, in Geneva hotel rooms and Pakistani safe houses, another meter spun. The CIA and ISI coordinated a pipeline that moved cash and weapons into Afghanistan with a kind of efficiency the Soviet side couldn't match in currency terms. A Stinger missile cost what it cost in dollars. A ruble had no vote in that market. The Soviets could adapt tactics, but they couldn't pay the adversary to stop adapting. And once those missiles appeared, the price of keeping aircraft aloft rose with each flare and each modified exhaust shroud. The squeeze changed behavior. Moscow leaned on barter, oil for grain, timber for pharmaceuticals, rolling stock for food. Deals got creative. Counter-trade contracts that swapped tons for tons, pages of terms to avoid a single dollar. Gold sales ticked up, reserves flowing quietly through Zurich to keep letters of credit alive. Each sale bought time and stripped cushion. Hard currency became triage. Pay for wheat, pay for machine tools, pay the interest. Delay the rest and hope next quarter's exports rebound. Creditors noticed. Western banks, burned by Latin America, looked at the USSR's earnings and hedged. Spreads widened, maturities shortened, and what had been routine working capital turned into negotiation. Soviet enterprises used to soft budgets found a hard edge when invoices in dollars couldn't be rolled over with slogans. A missed payment didn't mean a stern phone call. It meant shipments held at port, penalties compounded, insurance premiums up. Inside ministries, the dollar war felt like running with a hand on your throat. A refinery needed a replacement catalyst made by a small firm in the West. The price wasn't just money. It was permission, timing, compliance with export rules. A port needed a new crane gearbox the domestic supplier couldn't produce to spec. The foreign unit sat behind a license that would be reviewed in due course. In due course meant months. Months meant queues at docks, demurrage fees, and angry letters from enterprises whose inputs were now late, because a war 2,000 miles away had turned the whole country into a high-risk customer. There was a feedback loop nobody planned for. The cheaper oil got, the more barrels the USSR pumped to hit currency targets. More pumping strained pipelines and compressor stations already under-maintained because capital goods budgets were diverted. A breakdown here, a fire there, and output slipped just when every barrel mattered more. Maintenance deferrals that had looked clever on paper came due in real time. The Afghan battlefield magnified these pressures. Replacement helicopters needed imported components, heat-resistant alloys, avionics parts, machine tools to machine the parts. Even Soviet-made kit depended on Western subcomponents in places the public didn't see. Lose access or face delays, and readiness dipped. To compensate, commanders stretched the fleet harder. Stretching raised where raised demand for parts. Demand met a customs desk in Rotterdam with a new set of questions. And then there was morale priced in dollars. Special foods, medical supplies, and certain drugs came from abroad. When the currency ran tight, substitutions crept in. Soldiers noticed. Families noticed. The letters home carried a different tone, and the papers carried different headlines. Glasnost would amplify that soon, but before the cameras, the currency told the story first. Less choice, longer waits, more bargaining. In the end, the ruble's isolation became the war's quiet ally against Moscow. Battles are won with steel and skill, but campaigns require balanced sheets that clear outside your borders. The Soviet Union found itself paying in dollars it didn't earn enough of for a fight that turned every delay into a loss multiplier. While trucks fought gravity on the Salang, the Treasury fought gravity in world markets. Both fronts punished mistakes. And both proved how a limited war can become unlimited the moment you need to pay for it in someone else's money. Gosplan's Mirage, accounting tricks versus physical shortages. In Moscow, the numbers still behaved. That was the trick. Planned prices gave the war a manageable silhouette, fuel at a controlled rate, spare parts at last year's cost, transport within ministry allocations. On paper, the campaign's share of national income looked like a rounding error. In warehouses, it looked like empty shelves. To keep the columns straight, planners reached for familiar tools. You reclassify war expenses as transport inside the Ministry of Railways. You book medevac flights under health services. You call hazard pay a regional coefficient. None of it lies. It just hides the trail. Gosplan's job was to make plan and reality rhyme. When they didn't, you adjusted the rhyme scheme. Enterprises felt the twist. Directors got letters requesting voluntary, off-plan deliveries, bearings, tires, tool steel for urgent needs. They drew from reserves they were supposed to guard for breakdowns. Maintenance slips turned into habits. A lathe ran past inspection to hit quota, and the shop chief promised to catch up next quarter. Next quarter never arrived because the urgent needs were now permanent. Costs that didn't exist on the balance sheet piled up on the shop floor. Aircraft came back from the south burning through airframe hours faster than manuals assumed. Heat, dust, and altitude chewed engines. Overhaul cycles collapsed from nice round figures into an ugly curve. The price per hour didn't change on paper. The hours per mission did. Tires shredded on stone tracks. Rotors begged for new blades. Medevac pilots flew profiles that doubled stress. The bill hid in norms exceeded and temporary overfulfillment. A factory director learned the limits the hard way. He'd hit plan for 5 straight years by cannibalizing idle machines to keep the critical line humming. When a gearbox died on a grinder nobody could replace, he raided the training shop's equipment. It worked until a train carrying replacement parts got bumped for a military load 3 times in a month. The next quarter, the line collapsed. He still filed the reports, the language careful. Objective difficulties, corrective measures underway. The staff knew the truth. There was nothing left to cannibalize. Meanwhile, planners papered over gaps with accounting choreography. You push capital repairs into the next plan period. You rationalize inventories by redefining minimum stocks. You assume a higher utilization rate for rolling stock so fewer new cars need to be built. The graph smooths, the shop floor shakes. When an oil pump at a refinery started vibrating, the maintenance team used a refurbished part stretched beyond its hours because the new unit sat behind a foreign license. It worked until a bearing seized and a fire shut the unit for weeks. The spreadsheet marked unscheduled downtime. Workers marked overtime fatigue and a smell of burnt crude. What nobody knew at the time, because the data was siloed, was how the war amplified a stagnation already baked in. The late Brezhnev years had drifted. Slow productivity, aging capital, soft budgets that rewarded compliance, not repair. Afghanistan didn't create the slack, it consumed it. Every diverted ton, every deferred overhaul, every temporary transfer tightened a system that ran on buffers. The more they balanced the books, the less room they had to breathe. Rubles disguised scarcity because planned prices were political promises. Diesel at X per ton, a helicopter hour at Y, a hospital bed day at Z, but physics set the real prices. A turbine disc needed alloying elements sourced abroad. A hospital needed antibiotics that domestic labs couldn't meet at scale. A tire needed rubber mixed to a standard the supplier missed because their own mill needed bearings that were now on a flat car labeled priority, south. The accounting line said, no chain. The queue at the dispensary said otherwise. There was a moment in a ministry conference room that captured the Mirage. A deputy minister pointed to a chart showing military transport costs flat year over year. A logistics colonel, polite to a fault, cleared his throat. He described escort ratios doubling on the Salang, trucks idling longer, fuel consumption per delivered ton rising by 1/3. The deputy frowned, not at the colonel but at the category. That's not transport, he said. That's security. So the cost moved to another box and vanished from his slide. Enforcement costs spiraled in shadows. Inspectors chased diversion and theft along the supply chain, but every audit team needed vehicles, fuel, and per diem. The more you police the leaks, the less water reached the fields, and leaks multiplied because scarcity rewards ingenuity. A clerk padded manifests by a few crates. An officer signed for fuel that evaporated. A warehouseman swapped military rations into market stalls to fund repairs the budget wouldn't cover. None of it toppled the plan. All of it taxed it. Meanwhile, hospitals logged a different set of numbers. Beds occupied by wounded who'd require long-term care, prosthetics, and drugs priced off catalogs that didn't care about ruble plans. Their budgets balanced through in-kind support from enterprises, linens, food, volunteer shifts. Every donation looked noble and masked a subtraction from somewhere else. Bandages in Kabul meant fewer in Kazan the next month. Queues lengthened for repairs. Tractor engines, railcar wheels, compressors, everything waited. A director pleaded for a critical spare and got a deadline 3 plan periods out. He laughed, then didn't. Production targets held, and failure to meet them meant a party reprimand. So he paid a fixer to find the part through informal channels at a price 3 times the plan. The books showed compliance. The plant showed strain. This was the Mirage. Gosplan could make the numbers add, but not the parts. Accounting tricks moved costs around like furniture in a blackout. You could feel the shape of the room, but every step risked a bruise. And while the columns lined up, the shortages spoke louder, in halted lines, tired machines, and a country spending tomorrow's capacity to pay today's war. The human ledger, conscripts, pensions, and a generation's lost output. Numbers kept the war polite in meetings. People made it expensive. The draft boards ran hot. 18 and 19-year-olds pulled from factories, schools, and collective farms with notices that said special conditions. That stamp didn't just change a destination, it changed an economy. Every conscript removed from a lathe or a harvest meant a missing pair of hands that the plan still assumed were there. Enterprises marked them as temporarily absent. Nothing about the absence was temporary. Families learned the new math. A son's stipend helped with groceries, but the real costs arrived later. Wounded men returned with needs that didn't fit a budget. Physiotherapy, specialized shoes, drugs the clinic didn't stock, and time. Mothers left shifts early, wives skipped overtime, grandparents picked up childcare. Productivity drops don't show up as headlines. They show up as fewer finished goods and quieter assembly lines. Casualty flows translated into obligations. A death meant a pension. A severe wound meant a lifetime of medical care and benefits calibrated by formulas that had made sense for peacetime. The formulas didn't ask about mountain shrapnel lodged near a nerve or lungs burned by dust and smoke. Pension offices did what they could: paperwork, stamps, approvals. But every approval was a monthly claim on a budget that had assumed fewer claims. You can delay a machine overhaul. You can't delay a widow's payment without breaking something you can't fix with parts. War followed men home. Alcohol wasn't new to the Soviet story, but trauma gave it a job. Night terrors, sudden anger, a taste for risk. Plenty of veterans hid it, plenty couldn't. Absenteeism climbed in pockets where demobilized units clustered. Foremen who knew their crews started swapping tasks quietly, steering the edgy ones away from danger work and toward jobs that tolerated a missed morning. Output sagged a little, then a lot, and nobody wrote Afghanistan on the cause line. They wrote discipline. Black market networks grew like ivy on the walls of shortages. A sapper demobilized a Tashkent with a scar down his thigh and a phone book in his head. In uniform, he'd learned who to ask at a depot, which dispatcher could find a rail car, which warehouseman would look the other way for a price. Out of uniform, that knowledge became income. His state's salary bought less than the favors he could trade. The factory paid him twice, once in wages, once in gratitude when a critical part appeared from connections. The official economy lost him years before he quit. Hospitals added columns that didn't sit neatly with planned targets. Beds filled with men in their 20s. Prosthetics needed refitting as limbs changed shape. Psychiatric wards learned new scripts without naming them. The doctors logged it as post-traumatic when they were allowed to log it at all. Their pharmacy lists grew more foreign, tranquilizers that domestic labs struggled to replicate, antibiotics in short supply. Donations bridged gaps, linens from a textile mill, canned goods from a cannery, but every donation drained another line somewhere else. Demography bent. In regions that sent a disproportionate share, birth rates dipped, marriages delayed, divorces ticked up. That wasn't a moral failing. It was the stress math of a society asked to absorb pain in private while publicly maintaining calm. Housing queues lengthened, because benefits promised to veterans and widows pushed them forward, fair on paper, explosive in stairwells when neighbors compared wait times and trust fell a notch. Education felt it. Technical schools graduated fewer machinists because some sat in mountain posts learning to clear compounds instead of learning to read micrometers. Those who returned brought back a different skill set. Initiative under fire, yes, but also a belief that rules were suggestions. Useful in a firefight, corrosive in a production line that needed predictability. The hidden tax wasn't a line item. It was time. Time lost from work, time spent in clinics, time standing in lines for benefits, time relatives used to manage paperwork that multiplied because the system guarded itself with forms when resources got tight. Every hour spent proving entitlement was an hour not spent making or fixing. The state paid twice, once in rubles for the pension, once in foregone output because the claimant wasn't at a post. Then came Glasnost, and the cameras found the coffins. Openness didn't create the burden, it revealed it. Public tolerance narrowed, but budgets didn't. Social spending expanded because it had to. Pensions, disability payments, priority vouchers for housing and consumer goods, while revenue sagged under the weight of slowdown, absenteeism, and a shadow economy that skimmed taxes before they were counted. Ministries tried to plug the gap with exhortations and workplace campaigns. Trauma doesn't answer slogans. Here's where the ledger twists. A healthier workforce and a stable society were preconditions for reform. The war drew from both. Veterans could have been the backbone of modernization, a generation trained to operate complex equipment under stress. Some became that backbone. Many got lost in queues and kiosks, trading favors because favors worked. The economy adjusted to them. It didn't employ them fully. That's a loss you don't book until the future asks for output that never arrives. The bill didn't end at withdrawal. It matured. Men aged into chronic conditions, widows into old age with benefits indexed badly against inflation. The ruble overhang turned their stipends into paper. Trust, already thin, tore. And once trust tears, efficiency goes with it. The quiet glue in every system that lets instructions travel faster than envelopes. Adaptation costs, helicopters, Spetsnaz, and the price of learning. The battlefield taught faster than doctrine. Columns on the road bled, so commanders looked up. Air mobility became oxygen. My 8 transports and my 24 gunships stitched the map together. Valleys, ridge lines, remote outposts only reachable by rotor. Survival demanded it. But every hour in thin, dusty air wasn't just a mission. It was a withdrawal from a savings account nobody had replenished. Sorties surged. Dust, fine, talc-like, flowed into intakes and scraped through compressors. Engines ran hotter at altitude, oil broke down faster, and filters clogged twice as quickly. Maintenance crews learned to strip, clean, and reassemble in darkness, headlamps flickering because daylight meant incoming fire. Cannibalization turned from exception to routine. One grounded helicopter gave its heart to keep 2 others breathing. The cost hid in future ghosts. Airframes with mismatched histories, engines past comfort limits, logs annotated with permitted deviation. Night flying ramped up. It cut ambush risk, but demanded training that the peacetime curriculum hadn't fully funded. Pilots learned new profiles, low, fast, terrain hugging, flares ready, evasive climbs on instinct. Avionics lagged the ambition. Some units improvised with taped-over lights, crude IR suppressors, and tactics swapped like campfire lore. The learning curve worked. The price rose. Training hours at home units were raided to keep combat squadrons current. Students waited for instructors who'd been extended. Simulators sat silent because parts hadn't arrived. Spetsnaz expanded their footprint. Raids on caravans, ambushes on ridgelines, reconnaissance in places maps drew as contour lines and empty space. Their successes came wrapped in logistics most viewers never see. Special rations, mounting gear, radios with batteries that needed careful husbanding, medevac on-call windows that pulled helicopters from other missions. Precision costs more because it leaves less to chance. Every planned raid meant an orchestration of fuel caches, comms checks, and overlapping support that could have covered a battalion somewhere else. Results looked sharp. The back end looked thin. Electronic warfare crept into the routine. Jammers rode in pods and trucks. Countermeasures got added to checklists. Every flare dispenser bolted onto a helicopter added drag and weight, a marginal penalty that becomes real over mountains. Infrared suppressors helped, but their thermal penalty meant engines pushed harder, and pushing harder 8 hours. The insurance premium effect kicked in, more escorts for transports, more fighters in the air for a single lift, more pre-mission checks, more post-mission repairs. Efficiency per sortie fell even as mission success rates held. To keep that success, the system paid in parts, fatigue, and time. Ammunition burn rates told their own story. Mountain firefights are deceptive, short bursts, then nothing, then sudden flares. Units carried more than doctrine prescribed because resupply windows were unreliable. Helicopters sling-loaded pallets into tight LZs, pilots dumping cargo and lifting before the dust settled. Each extra crate meant an extra sortie somewhere, and extra sorties multiplied maintenance. Back home, factories logged rush orders for 12.7 and 23 rounds, flares, rockets. Lathes turned late into night. A bearing supplier missed its civilian quota because an artillery plant took precedence. On paper, priorities were correct. On floors, quality slipped. Adaptation spread to clothing and kit. Winter gear suited to European plains failed at altitude. The army diverted mountain boots, tents, and sleeping systems from civilian supply. Climbers waiting for equipment found shelves bare. The cost of that trade-off wasn't an immediate number. It showed up as safety incidents, absenteeism due to illness, and a quiet anger that eroded the willingness to volunteer for extra shifts. Meanwhile, training pipelines lengthened. Mountain warfare skills, night landing drills, convoy escort tactics, none of it came free. Instructors cycled from the front to classrooms and back again, and the gap between arrivals and departures widened. Units at home fell below readiness norms because their best technicians and NCOs were either down south or recovering from it. Aircraft awaiting overhaul stacked up on aprons. Engines sat in crates missing one imported seal. Maintenance bays ran 3 shifts and still slipped the line. Air safety incidents crept upward, the kind of near misses that don't headline but haunt crews. Brownout landings went sideways. Torque limits flirted with. Warning lights became background noise. Investigators wrote careful reports. Pilot error, environmental conditions, maintenance backlog. Each category pointed to the same route, adaptation under strain. Here's the irony the ledger hates. Better tactics saved lives and won fights. They also prolonged the war's calendar. Every successful air assault that avoided a road ambush kept the unit operating, which meant more missions next month and the month after. The lifetime cost of the campaign rose with each efficiency because efficiency didn't replace strategy. It bought time for it. Time is expensive. Factories tried to catch up. Rotor blades require precision, balanced to grams, materials treated to endure flex and heat. The plants pushed output, but their own machines needed overhauls. A single grinder down meant a week lost on a production lot, and the spare part was, again, stuck behind a priority stamp for something else. Directors phoned ministries, ministries reshuffled queues, queues turned into promises, promises aged into shortages. Across town from all of this, planners sketched fleet replacement curves that assumed peacetime wear. The curves bowed under reality. Airframes reached end of life early. Engines met overhaul limits faster. Aircrew rotations drove up personnel costs as hazard bonuses accumulated and medical leaves multiplied. The ruble line for aviation didn't spike dramatically. The physical line did. More grounded machines, more fatigue, more quiet funerals. Adaptation kept units alive. It also tethered the economy to a burn rate it couldn't match with fresh capacity. Learning in war carries tuition. In Afghanistan, the USSR paid it in metal fatigue, human stamina, and factories that had to fix tomorrow with tools from yesterday. The shadow economy, corruption, diversion, and price signals in disguise. While helicopters learned new tricks and planners moved columns, a parallel war economy took shape along the roads, rails, and depots. Scarcity spoke a language the plan refused to print, so people translated it into bribes, favors, and side deals. Every diverted liter, ration, and spare part became a hidden tax, paid not once, but twice, first by the state, then by whoever needed the thing that vanished. It started small. A driver shaved a few cans from a fuel truck, calling it evaporation. A warehouseman swapped a crate of ration tins for cash that fixed a leaking roof his budget didn't cover. An officer signed a receipt for cargo he knew hadn't fully arrived, trusting that the difference would be made up down the line. Down the line didn't exist. It was the street where price signals reappeared in code. How much did you want that tire, that bearing, that extra belt of ammunition before the inspection? Bazaars bloomed from Kabul to Tashkent. Soviet canned meat stacked next to Afghan fruit. Factory-made boots sat beside handmade sandals. Radio batteries changed hands for banknotes and favors. The war's logistics bled into commerce because commerce was the only mechanism fast enough to patch the gaps logistics left. A sergeant sold a box of rations to buy antibiotics his unit's clinic lacked. A depot clerk quietly earmarked a generator for a hospital after a courier fee crossed the desk. Nobody called it theft. They called it solving problems. Price signals in disguise guided everything. A phone call with 3 pauses meant the railcar would arrive only if someone helped the dispatcher. A stamped form with a corner folded meant the line foreman had already reserved half the shipment for a friend in another ministry. The planned economy hated prices because prices exposed scarcity. The shadow economy loved them because scarcity gave prices teeth. Favors became currency. Time became usury. A micro-story cut through the abstractions. A logistics clerk in Termes learned the art of the manifest. He'd nudge weights, round up here, trim there, so that a truck appeared fuller than it was and a second truck. His second truck could carry surplus to a buyer with cash. 2 years and 4 manipulated sheets later, his brother drove a new larder in a city where official waiting lists still stretched years. He told himself the system owed him. He wasn't alone. Corruption wasn't just greed. It was adaptation to rules that couldn't deliver. A convoy commander knew that paying a local fixer in cash and diesel got him safe passage faster than waiting for a new order. An enterprise director discovered that a gift of televisions to a garrison guaranteed his wagons wouldn't be bumped again. Each workaround made sense. Together, they raised the cost of moving anything, anywhere. Enforcement fought back. Auditors appeared. They needed cars, fuel, per diems, escorts. Investigations dragged. Reports named names, and a few officers fell hard. Most didn't, because the line between survival and graft blurred under pressure. Every crackdown pushed the trade deeper and added friction. The state spent more to move fewer goods, because every checkpoint, every signature, every stamped seal demanded its own toll. The feedback loop tightened. As scarcity grew, bribe rates rose. As bribe rates rose, more people opted out of the official queue, starving it further. Units learned that the fastest way to get a part was to buy it from the bazaar, often the very part they'd signed for a month earlier. The plan paid for production once. The war paid again to reacquire it. Double payment, half delivery. Trust eroded in quiet ways. A captain started counting jerrycans like jewels, accusing his own men of theft before a single liter moved. A factory foreman locked a storeroom with 2 keys and slept with one under his pillow. A hospital chief turned away a truck because the last donation arrived half-rotten, and nobody took responsibility. The more locks, the more delays. The more delays, the higher the price. The higher the price, the more people slipped into the shadow to get things done. Meanwhile, the street learned real-time economics. Exchange rates for rubles against dollars or against tins of meat spread by rumor. A conscript, hazard pay converted into cigarettes faster than it turned into goods at the state store. Wedding dowries shifted from cash to commodities, fabric, sugar, fuel. The ruble still bought pride on paper. On the curb, it bought less every month. Here's the sting. Corruption wasn't an anomaly of war. It was the mechanism that let the war continue under a plan that couldn't keep up. It delivered short-term fixes by taxing long-term capacity. Each siphoned liter meant another train had to roll. Each diverted crate meant another factory missed plan. And the more the system relied on this invisible trade, the less it could measure its own losses, until the shortages spoke louder than any ledger, and the Shadow finally looked like the main event. The Stinger shock, technology, air denial, and cost curves. They didn't arrive with fanfare. They arrived in crates that changed flight plans. The first Stingers surfaced in the valleys as rumors, smoke trails that climbed too fast, helicopters that didn't make the next radio check, crews who'd done everything right and still fell from clean sky. Air superiority had been the one thing the Soviets could count on to bend terrain. Suddenly, the sky had conditions. Before Stinger, ambushes meant altitude and timing. After Stinger, they meant equations. Crews relearned the map. Daylight meant risk. Ridgelines meant exposure. Linger time over targets shrank. Pilots kept one eye on the mission and one on the flare button, counting to 3 before popping a string, then jinking toward Shadow. Each flare was a small payment on a larger bill. Weight carried, fuel burned, maintenance added. Protective measures stacked up. IR suppressors went on tailpipes, adding heat, load, and drag. New flight profiles cut in, hugging contours, climbing steep only when they had to. The result was safety purchased in minutes and meters. Longer routes, lower ceilings, more time in the danger band where a lucky shot could still catch metal. Insurance in aviation looks like redundancy. Redundancy multiplies cost. Commanders shifted the ratio. More escorts per transport, more guns per lift, more jamming on every route. A resupply that once took 3 birds now took 5. The math spread past the flight line. Fuel demand rose because flight hours rose. Spare parts demand rose because cycles rose. Mechanics worked longer because inspections expanded. Efficiency per sortie fell, but the mission count didn't. To deliver the same ton, you flew more tons of precaution. Losses forced choices. A down Mi-24 wasn't just a machine. It was a factory's year of work and a crew's years of training. Replacing it meant pulling from a pipeline already stretched by wear. The battlefield didn't care that a turbine disc needed nickel and cobalt sourced through channels under sanctions scrutiny. It cared that the next Dawn's mission needed a gunship, and the hangar door opened on 3 grounded hulks and one that coughed during startup. Meanwhile, Afghan fighters learned too. A Stinger is more than a tube, it's morale. Word spread that the sky could be contested. Firing positions moved, decoys improved, and ambush doctrine matured. The Soviets answered with more reconnaissance, more deception, more preemptive fires. Each adaptation was sound, each added tasks. More reconnaissance flights meant more exposure, more flares, more engine cycles ticking closer to overhaul lines that maintenance chiefs dreaded. The economic curve bent in a quiet arc. The cost to keep a helicopter survivable rose faster than the effect it brought. You could lift a squad to a ridge, but to do it safely you needed an escort, a jammer, a timing window, a refuel plan with reserves, and an alternate route if a threat popped. Multiply that across provinces, across months, and the marginal cost of each mission edged upward even as the marginal benefit edged downward. The curve didn't shout. It whispered in requisition forms marked urgent. Pilots adapted with craft and grit. Night became a friend again, colder air, fewer eyes. But night flying demanded a stack of things the system struggled to deliver. Dependable NV gear, training hours, a maintenance standard that caught the small faults that turn lethal in the dark. Units built their own checklists, shared what worked, and logged what nearly killed them. The near misses multiplied in the margins, and commanders read them like weather, part warning, part inevitability. Factories back home got new orders, more flares, more composite rotor blades with better heat tolerance, more seal kits, more bearings with tighter tolerances. Machine tools ran hot. The bottlenecks were specific, a heat treatment furnace out of spec, a grinder that walked, a supplier in a different republic that demanded payment in kind because rubles felt thin. Directors made deals to keep lines moving, swapping goods for goods, bartering overtime meals for extra shifts, promising bonuses whose buying power eroded before payday. Here's the thing the balance sheet missed. Denial doesn't have to be perfect to be expensive. The Stinger didn't close the sky, it priced it. Every additional percentage point of survival demanded disproportionate spend, more mass to carry protection, more craft to avoid exposure, more planning hours to thread safe corridors that shrank with each new tube in a new valley. The campaign's center of gravity had been mobility. Mobility now came with a surcharge. Morale absorbed the signal. Crews started measuring luck as a consumable. Superstitions grew. Call signs retired after bad weeks. Rituals before takeoff. A certain song on a recorder. Ground troops felt it too. The long wait for rotors on a hot LZ got longer. The noise overhead thinner. Air will come used to be a promise. It became a variable. The stinger also shifted what the Soviets asked of their allies. Afghan government outposts needed more supplies because ground convoys faced ambush and air couldn't linger. More translated into flight hours that fed back into the same curve. Trainers pushed Afghan pilots hard, but training pipelines suffered the same deficits. Parts, instructors, fuel. A partner airframe grounded by a missing SEAL was one more lift the Soviets had to fly. Moscow, the reports didn't say we lost the sky. They said increased attrition risk, countermeasures effective with caveats, sortie efficiency impacted, accurate words with careful edges. But budgets felt the blunt end. You could measure the Stinger's cost in rubles spent on countermeasures, in gold sold to cover an avionics shipment, in work hours diverted from civilian projects to military spares. You could also measure it in weight, protection bolted on, crew hearts heavier, lifts lighter. Technology shifted the battlefield with a simple proposition: make the enemy pay more to do the same thing. In Afghanistan, the Stinger cashed that check. The Soviets kept flying. They just paid for every kilometer twice, once in fuel and metal, once in fear and time. Oil, debt, and the squeeze, external accounts under strain. Back in Moscow, oil had always been the quiet guarantor. You pumped, you shipped, you got dollars, and those dollars bought the things the plan couldn't make. Then the floor gave way. Saudi taps opened, prices slid, and the Soviet export machine woke up earning less for the same work. It wasn't an ideological defeat. It was a spreadsheet that suddenly didn't balance. Export earnings financed grain in lean harvests, precision kit, and the subsidies that kept client states aligned. When crude fell into the teens, every promise felt heavier. Pipeline miles didn't shrink, compressor stations didn't get cheaper, transit fees didn't go on sale, but the incoming stream narrowed. Gosplan stared at accounts that once carried a cushion and now looked like ice in spring. The trade-offs got mean. Cut imports and you slow the modernization already lagging. Cut client support and you signal that alliances have fine print. Some ministries tried finesse. Swap rubles for rubles with Comic-Con partners. Lean on clearing accounts. Pay with goods instead of cash. But you can't barter your way to a catalyst a Western refinery makes, or to control systems tied to export licenses. Dollars still decided. A micro-story made the macro vivid. A pipeline maintenance crew in Western Siberia logged a vibration anomaly. Nothing dramatic, just a bearing whining before it failed. The replacement assembly existed, but the order got bumped 3 times while the ministry triaged foreign purchases. Winter hit, the unit limped, a seal blew, crude spilled, and the line came down. What would have been a 3-day fix turned into a multi-month outage as thaw cycles complicated access, and the backlog of parts got uglier. Output lost, fines paid, reputations dented. One deferred invoice turned into a season of absence. Western banks adjusted their posture. The Soviet Union still got credit, but maturities shortened and spreads widened. A country once treated like a sovereign constant now looked like a borrower with volatile income and rising calls on cash. Negotiations that used to involve a few signatures and a stamp took rounds. Risk committees, insurance riders, covenants that specified what happened if exports fell again. Shipments held at port because letters of credit weren't immaculate. A ship idling burns money, so does a factory waiting for its cargo. The oil glut built a trap. To cover budget holes, the USSR pumped more to make up in volume what it lost in price. More pumping stressed equipment already on stretched maintenance. Fires that would have been rare popped more often. A compressor seizure here, a station blackout there, and throughput fell precisely when every barrel counted. Engineers begged for capital upgrades. Accountants circled numbers with red pencils. Neither got what they needed. Debt pressure didn't arrive as a siren. It showed up as choices. Pay interest in full and delay a shipment of wheat. or clear the grain and roll a payment into next quarter with a promise that sounded thinner each time. Some quarters, gold bridged the gap. Sales through Switzerland and London kept the machine turning, but every ingot gone was one less buffer against the next wobble. Inside enterprises, quality took the hit you can't fully log. A turbine blade maker accepted a lot of alloy that barely met spec because the Western additive was late. The blades passed test, then failed early in the field. The failure fed back into the same loop: more spare orders, more dollars needed, more calls to banks already cautious. Meanwhile, consumer imports shrank. Shelves got barer, lines longer, and the ruble's psychological value fell another notch. Client states felt the chill. Cuba, Vietnam, Angola subsidized all shipments and credits got renegotiated. Allies understood budgets, but they also counted on the old reliability. A delayed tanker in Havana meant blackouts. A smaller credit line in Eastern Europe meant factories already creaking missed another upgrade. Influence has a price tag even when you're not bidding. Credibility costs to maintain. The Kremlin paid less, and everyone noticed. At home, accidents rose in the strangest places. A fertilizer plant ran a compressor past its maintenance window because the spare rotor was stuck in customs over a licensing question. It failed with a bang, and the plant went dark. The outage washed back into agriculture. Less fertilizer, lower yields, more grain imports needed, more dollars gone. That's how macro squeezes creep, through a chain of small decisions forced by a single constraint that never relaxes. The Afghan line item didn't look huge in rubles. In dollars, it showed up as the paywall on every adaptation: avionics, alloys, medical supplies, even the shipping insurance for crates headed to the front. And because oil prices set the size of the wallet, every spike in war demand met a thinner purse. Ministries tried to firewall accounts, this for agriculture, that for defense, but currency is fluid when shortages rise. A request stamped urgent from the south displaced a motor the energy sector needed, and the energy shortfall cut export capacity, which cut dollars, which cut options. The loop fed itself. By the mid-80s, the squeeze felt like weather, always there, damp in the walls. You could live with it, you just couldn't build with it. And without building, reform was a slogan in a room that still leaked. Perestroika meets the war, reform versus resistance. By the time the oil squeeze felt like weather, a new word tried to change the climate: perestroika. Gorbachev walked in 1985 with energy and a diagnosis. Stagnation wasn't a phase, it was a habit. Reform needed space, capital, and calm. The war ate all three. He moved early on optics and blood. Troop reductions signaled intent. Geneva talks, culminating in the 1988 Accords, promised an exit that could be sold at home and tolerated abroad. But reducing a footprint didn't shrink the bill overnight. Withdrawal planning is logistics in reverse: routes to secure, equipment to rotate, commitments to cover while units pulled back. Every step toward peace drew extra on the same tired rails, aircraft, and budgets. Inside the economy, reform changed the language that had hidden costs. Enterprise autonomy meant plants saw prices closer to reality, inputs revalued, inventories marked, losses named. Suddenly, the free helicopter hour revealed a shadow price in steel, alloys, and imported subcomponents. Directors who'd once filed cheerful compliance reports started submitting hard numbers. A rotor blade cost X in rubles before. Now it carried Y in foreign obligations and Z in penalties if deliveries slipped. The war's weight stopped being a rumor and became a price tag. Soft budget rules fought back. Ministries had long practiced rescue: overdraw, get covered; misplan, receive a transfer; break a machine, get a quiet replacement from a reserve. Autonomy asked them to live with the consequences. But the war continued demanding priority loads, priority parts, priority cash. A director who refused a temporary requisition from defense learned that autonomy had borders. Reform tried to harden lines. The war blurred them. Glasnost ripped the veil. Coffins on television, mothers speaking into microphones, reporters visiting wards where young men stared past cameras. Investigations uncovered theft, abuse, and incompetence in places the uniform had shielded. The shock wasn't that bad things happened. It was that they were seen, compared, debated. Public patience, once managed by silence, shrank in open air. The party's old bargain, sacrifice for stability, now had a ledger on the evening news. Savings fled into goods. With openness came a quiet admission. The ruble in your account might not buy what the paper said. People tried to protect themselves by buying anything real: appliances, fabrics, spare parts, sugar. Stores were already thin, queues lengthened. That was the ruble overhang, money chasing goods that didn't exist because the system had long priced them wrong. The war amplified it by diverting the very items people reached for: fuel, metal, transport, attention. Investment dropped because uncertainty punished commitment. Enterprises that saw their inputs revalued and their outputs questioned held back. Why expand a line when next quarter's prices might double again, when your best technicians were in recovery, when the rail cars you need could be rerouted south without notice? Banks, such as they were, learned risk the hard way. Credit tightened, then evaporated for anything that didn't carry a stamp from someone who could still command a train. In the Kremlin, arguments split along familiar seams. Hardliners insisted that reform was the instability, not the cure. They wanted discipline restored, the press quieted, the war managed with a firmer hand. Reformers countered that the war was the instability, the loudest claim in an economy that couldn't pay its promises. Gorbachev tried to balance, talk in Geneva, pull brigades on schedule, keep reform momentum without tearing the party. Balance is expensive when both sides invoice you. Enterprise autonomy exposed the old trick of hiding war costs in civilian lines. Procurement officers began to push back. A factory asked to temporarily deliver a batch of bearings off plan sent a neat reply. At revalued prices, the order would run a loss, and autonomy allowed rejection. The phone rang. Autonomy yielded to patriotic duty, then to a not-so-subtle note about future allocations. Directors learned the new dance. Show numbers, state refusal, accept a compromise that still hurt. Accounting truth met political gravity. The media did something statistics never could. It made the corruption personal. A story about an officer selling fuel had a face. A segment about a hospital lacking anesthetics had names. Viewers drew lines from those faces to their empty shelves and angry commutes. Legitimacy is a resource, too. Perestroika tried to add it through candor. The war subtracted it through repetition. Reform's success hinged on productivity gains. New machines, better incentives, fewer stupid delays. But the system that could have delivered them was still patched with war workarounds. A plant needed a Western control system to modernize a line. The license got stuck in politics. The dollars got stuck in debt service. The delivery slot got given to a defense supplier, quietly deemed more urgent. The plant limped along with analog controls, and a manager who learned to barter favors instead of managing futures. Then there was the strategic bind that became a sentence whispered in corridors. End the war or lose the state. Delay raises the price. Each month the campaign consumed fuel, spares, and human focus that reforms required in bulk. Each concession to old practice, another off-plan requisition, another free bailout for a failing enterprise tied to defense, signaled that rules were suggestions again. Reform needs credibility as much as cash. The war dented both. Gorbachev pushed harder on talks. The Geneva channels opened, timetables emerged, and Afghan policy began to pivot from win to leave responsibly. Military commanders adjusted, ministries braced. And still, every step toward the exit billed the present, stockpiling for withdrawals, repairing just enough to ferry equipment home, paying hazard bonuses to crews who'd cover the last convoy. The promise of savings sat on the far side of a bridge that cost more to cross because the road behind had been mined by years of shortcuts. By the time the calendars showed departure, the domestic economy had learned a new discomfort. Rules changing mid-game, prices moving underfoot, headlines replacing whispers. Perestroika wasn't theater, it was triage with cameras on. Reform needed calm. The war made calm a luxury. And as the last agreements took shape, one truth settled in. Ending the fighting would stop the bleeding, not heal the wound. The liabilities had already compounded, and the system that had learned to fake balance now had to face the bill in daylight. Withdrawal, Wreckage, and the bill that arrives later. They called it a timetable. On the ground, it felt like a tightrope. Leaving saves lives, but exits don't run on goodwill. They run on fuel, parts, and a final burst of organization from a system already frayed. The last phase of the war looked like order. Phased pullbacks, covered routes, handovers. The ledger called it something else. Write-downs. Equipment tells the truth first. Years of sand, heat, and salt had turned metal brittle. Vehicles slated to drive home failed in inspection lines. Those that passed groaned on the first gradients north. Commanders made triage decisions no one wanted to own. Strip this to keep that moving. Torch what you can't recover. Log the loss under combat damage, even when the culprit was time. Abandonment isn't just a photo of a burned-out hull. It's a line where the factory expected a return that never arrives. A helicopter regiment crossed the river with a proud banner and a private ache. 40% of their aircraft were grounded, engines timed out, gearboxes noisy, rotor blades with hairline cracks spidering under paint. The home base welcomed them with ceremony and a maintenance backlog that could swallow a year. Hangars filled with machines that needed everything at once. Overhauls, avionics checks, new transmissions. The parts lists read like a foreign catalogue. Hospitals filled in a different way. Veterans didn't stop needing care because a date on a treaty said the war was over. Clinics logged surges in orthopedic work, pulmonary issues from dust exposure, chronic pain that blurred into dependency. Psychiatry wards took new patients with old wounds, sleep that wouldn't come, moods that swung hard, a startle response that never cooled. The budget names these post-conflict obligations. Families call them Tuesdays. Demobilization hit factories like a wave that didn't bring relief. Men returned with priority employment papers, and enterprises tried to honor them. But production lines were brittle, orders uncertain, and managers already juggling shortages. Some veterans slotted in. Many stood in machine halls with foremen who had no assignments to offer. Idle labor pays a wage, not a dividend. In the canteen, they traded stories and phone numbers, and the shadow economy grew another ring. Write-downs rolled across ministries. Transport tabulated wagons ruined by years of heavy, uneven loads. Railways recorded bridges needing reinforcement. Energy tallied generators run past spec to power remote bases. Health tallied prosthetics orders that would last a lifetime. None of these columns vanished with a signature in Geneva. They matured. Deferred maintenance, changed tense, and became critical repair. Internationally, the exit carried a cost you can't book to a single department. Reliability. Clients who'd banked on Soviet staying power recalculated. A missed oil shipment used to be a storm. Now it looked like policy. Eastern European partners demanded softer terms, hedged their bets with Western credit, and watched Moscow more than they listened. Influence requires margin. The war had spent it. Inventory audits back home read like detective novels. Warehouses held lists that didn't match rooms. Tools checked out for temporary field modification never came back. Test equipment needed for quality control in civilian plants had quietly migrated south and now returned in boxes, dented and half-working. Every unaccounted for meter, gauge, and jig meant a production run somewhere would start late or finish wrong. Directors who'd threaded the needle for years now faced the blank page. How to meet plan with a toolkit that had been everywhere but here. There was a political bill too. Veterans expected housing and the rules said they would get it. Housing stock didn't appear because the calendar turned. Queues got reshuffled, promises got louder, stairwells got angrier. A regional party secretary, cornered by mothers and wives, promised faster allocations. He meant it. He didn't control the bricks. The economy tried to reclaim capacity. Training programs retooled to fold veterans into civilian trades, machining, welding, transport. The problem wasn't willingness, it was throughput. Instructors had retired, machines needed repair, and the good gear had been diverted years earlier to support the war. A class of 30 practiced on 2 working lathes. The rest watched and waited, another kind of queue. Meanwhile, the numbers that once hid behind euphemisms stepped into light. Pension outlays climbed on spreadsheets pinned in ministries where everyone finally spoke plainly. Replacement cycles for vehicles and aircraft, deferred during fighting, now lined up like bills in a stack, due together. Fuel allocations that had been extraordinary became expectations. Demobilized units still needed to move, to deliver, to resettle. Temporary had calcified into baseline. The last convoys crossed the river, engines coughing, flags stiff in winter air. Cameras filmed them and cut to anchors who said the war was over. It was, but costs don't obey broadcasts. They settle into systems and ask the same question every morning. What will you not do today because you must pay for yesterday? The answer, multiplied across factories, rails, hospitals, and homes, was the wreckage that didn't make the news because it didn't explode. It just stayed. The union's balance sheet, transfers, subsidies, and the breaking point. Withdrawal didn't free the center, it exposed it. The Soviet Union had always balanced on a quiet mechanism. Moscow collected and redistributed. Energy-rich republics shipped oil and gas north and west. Industrial republics shipped machinery. Agricultural regions shipped grain. In return, the center sent back subsidies, cheap fuel, food price supports, capital investment, and the soft guarantees that kept the whole mosaic from rattling apart. That transfer machine needed credibility and surplus. The war had eaten both. Subsidies weren't just kindness, they were glue. Controlled bread prices calmed cities, capped electricity rates kept factories humming, transport subsidies let far republics feel included. But cheap was a policy, not a cost. The difference lived in the budget, and the budget now carried extra weights. Veterans' benefits, hospital expansions, replacement cycles for equipment burned out by the campaign, and an energy sector that needed cash for repairs after years of pumping hard for fewer dollars. Strains showed up in places nobody associated with Afghanistan. A Baltic port saw cranes idle because bearings hadn't arrived. Funds for imports had been reallocated to cover a spike in medical purchases. In the Caucasus, electricity brownouts turned evening shifts into guesswork. A gas compressor due for overhaul was held in queue behind priority, shipments that never quite cleared. Every missed subsidy payment, every late allocation, moved the argument from spreadsheets to streets. Republics started adding their own math. We send this much up, a finance minister in a Western republic would say, and we get back this much down. The gap widened. Energy subsidies, once the crown jewel of fidelity, drained the center. Keeping fuel cheap meant paying refiners to sell below cost, while maintenance costs climbed. Food price supports did the same. Procurement agents bought high to keep farms alive and sold low to keep cities quiet. The spread had always existed. Now it yawned. A hospital in a provincial capital learned how far a transfer reached. Anesthetics ordered months earlier were in transit. The pharmacy shelves held bottles with labels curling at the edges, half full. Nurses stretched doses and prayed. The chief doctor called the regional health committee. The committee called Moscow. Moscow called the railways. The railway dispatcher saw the caller ID and said the thing he wasn't supposed to say. It's on a wagon behind special cargo. When that moves, yours moves. The call ended. The next morning, 2 operations were postponed. Patients waited with blankets over their knees. Tax compliance eroded because belief eroded. Enterprises, state ones, learned to stash. A director who once banked on transfers arriving leaned into side deals and off-book reserves. For contingencies, he told his deputy, and the deputy nodded, because contingencies had become life. The ruble's meaning thinned as goods vanished. Wages rose on paper and shrank in stores. The shadow economy, fattened by war, now handled everyday things, soap, flour, spark plugs, because official channels wheezed. Strikes popped like rivets. Baltic shipyard workers downed tools, demanding better pay, better supplies, better everything. In mining towns, shifts slowed to a crawl, production targets missed by inches, then miles. Demonstrations in the Caucasus fused economic grievance with national pride. A banner might say freedom, but the chant included bread. Moscow could still send troops. It struggled to send grain on time. Transfers became political theater. The center announced emergency aid packages to regions in crisis, diverting trains and trucks in televised shows of care. The problem wasn't sincerity, it was arithmetic. Each emergency robbed another's routine. A food convoy to one city meant an empty shelf in another. Subsidies felt like lottery tickets, some winners, many losers, growing resentment all around. The war's fiscal legacy sat under these scenes like bedrock. Higher social outlays weren't temporary, they were structural. Degraded capital stock wasn't a talking point, it was a machine park older than its manuals, demanding parts the system couldn't source without hard currency. Lower export capacity wasn't bad luck, it was the dividend from deferring maintenance to pay for a fight and an image. When planners looked for money to invest in reform, new controls, automation, safety, they found veterans' pensions, hospital lines, and debt service waiting in front of them. Republic leaders read the ledger and asked harder questions about union. Why should we send when we don't receive? Wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a speech in a parliament. Transfer formulas, once bureaucratic, became symbols of exploitation. The phrase, center's ability to pay, lost its usual calm and gained a tremor. In meetings, Moscow promised. In warehouses, workers shrugged at empty pallets. A regional finance chief told a quiet truth to a visiting delegation. We know the center wants to help. We also know it can't. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Behind him, a map of the Republic's budget hung with pins in red where clinics had closed a wing, blue where schools ran half-days to save heat, yellow where factories had cut shifts. The pins were clusters along rail lines, a cartography of scarcity. The tipping point wasn't a single event. It was disbelief turning into behavior. Enterprises withheld remittances until arrears are settled. Households hoarded everything that stored value. Republics passed decrees prioritizing local supply over union orders. Each act made sense locally, and each shaved the center's power. Claims exceeded means, not in theory but in daily practice. When Moscow called for solidarity, people heard a new subtext: we can't pay. Then came the shock that exposed the hollow core, not a battlefield, but a sequence of political and financial jolts that tested whether the union was still a thing you could fund. Submarines could still sail, rockets could still launch. The balance sheet. It was now a list of promises no ledger could reconcile, and a country discovering that glue works until it dries out. The 1989-1991 Cascade, defaults, coups, and the economic unraveling. Pressure found the seams first. Late payments turned into quiet defaults, state enterprises missing deadlines to foreign suppliers, ministries rolling arrears with letters that said temporary. Ports held containers until letters of credit cleared. Some never did. A Polish bank refused a shipment. An Italian insurer raised premiums mid-contract. The center, used to smoothing trouble with authority, discovered that credit committees didn't salute. Price reforms tiptoed in and slipped on ice. Limited liberalization aimed to clear queues by letting some prices float. Instead, shelves emptied faster. Goods moved to the shadow where rubles priced by habit met rubles priced by fear. Wages chased tags. Tags ran. Enterprise directors hoarded inputs because tomorrow looked worse than today, and hoarding became policy, not paranoia. Republics hoarded too. Warehouses marked for union distribution got relabeled for local needs. Rail dispatchers took calls from regional leaders before they answered Moscow. A train full of flour skipped a junction it once honored, rolled into a city where crowds waited and never left. The supply chain that had stretched across 11 time zones now snapped back into provinces that wanted to eat before they exported. Factories slowed, then stalled. Not for lack of orders, for lack of parts and trust. A turbine plant paused a line because a gear arrived out of spec from a supplier who'd lost his quality inspector to a better offer at a bazaar. A steel mill ran a furnace cold to save coke it wasn't sure it would get next month. Workers clocked in, swept, played chess, went home with pay that bought less by the week. The ruble turned from money into an argument. Veterans felt it sharper. Hospitals delayed surgeries for lack of anesthetics. Pensions lagged. Vouchers promised housing that never came. Men who'd survived mountain firefights found themselves bargaining for antibiotics in a hallway. Angry delegations visited party offices with letters, then with chants. The war's bill, long abstract, now had lines in front of buildings. Foreign creditors watched a sovereign borrower become a patchwork. Some loans rolled, others froze. Negotiators asked for time and got calendars. Oil output slipped with winter outages and spring thaws. Export volumes missed targets. Dollars thinned. Gold sales bridged weeks, not quarters. The phrase arrears restructuring entered memos that used to say settlement. Politics tried a referendum. In March 1991, most voters marked a square to preserve a renewed union, with several republics not participating. The result told a truth and hid another. People wanted food, heat, wages that meant something. Union sounded like those things bundled. Regional leaders heard a different clause. Renewed meant renegotiated. They moved to write their own terms. Sovereignty declarations, control over local assets, taxes kept at home unless bargained away. Then came August 1991. Hardliners rolled tanks into Moscow to reverse the drift and restore a version of order they remembered. It wasn't just a coup, it was a credit event. Traders halted, banks paused, shipments sat. In the streets, crowds ringed the White House. Soldiers hesitated, commanders blinked. The putsch collapsed in days, but the damage to authority lasted. If the center could be challenged by its own guardians, what guarantee did a promise carry? After the coup, the unraveling accelerated. Republics that had waited moved. Ukraine declared independence. The Baltics formalized what they'd already lived. Others drafted laws that put local courts above union decrees. Ministries split in two, one in Moscow issuing instructions, one in a capital issuing different instructions. Enterprises chose whichever stamp delivered diesel. Price liberalization in January 1992 would slam the door, but the door was already open. Even before formal decontrol, prices moved in side rooms and side streets. January just made it official. Savings evaporated, wages trailed. Factories tried to set their own tags and learn supply and demand the hard way. The ruble zone fractured into IOUs, coupons and vouchers that worked in one town and not the next. Supply chains broke in odd places. A brake pad plant stopped because its resin supplier was now in a different country demanding dollars. A bread factory cut shifts because yeast came from across a new border that hadn't agreed on customs. Train crews refused long hauls without prepayment and cash they trusted. The network that once obeyed the plan now obeyed risk. The military felt the split like a draft through an open window. Units stranded outside the Russian Federation looked to host republics for fuel. Some got it. Some bartered weapons for diesel to get home. An air regiment swapped spare parts for food. Commanders who'd learned to stretch budgets in Afghanistan now learned to negotiate sovereignty at a checkpoint. Meanwhile, external priorities shifted. German reunification pulled Western attention and money toward Berlin, not Moscow. Aid to the USSR came with conditions: reform faster, privatize, liberalize. The center tried to comply while it still existed. It was like repairing tracks while the train left for another gauge. By December 1991, 3 signatures in a forest house ended the union as a legal thing. The economic thing had ended earlier, minute by minute, as defaults, hoarding, and fear rewired behavior. The Afghan war hadn't caused the signatures. It had weakened the organs that might have mediated panic. Rails reliable enough to move grain without bribes. Budgets flexible enough to cushion shocks. Legitimacy deep enough to ask for sacrifice and get compliance. Step back and you see the mechanism. Claims exceeded means. The currency lost authority. People, firms, and republics made local choices to survive, and those choices dissolved a country faster than any invasion could. The collapse didn't arrive with a single bang. It arrived like a factory going quiet, one machine at a time, until all you could hear was your own breath. How a war bankrupts a system, mechanics and lessons. Step back from the convoys, the memos, the queues, and look at the plumbing. Bankruptcy here isn't a courtroom, it's a system running out of slack. 3 channels carried the damage: fiscal, material, and social, braided with an external choke that tightened as oil sagged and credit stiffened. Start with fiscal. The budget looked balanced by moving costs between boxes, but claims multiplied: pensions, disability, widows' benefits, hazard pay, hospital expansions, equipment replacement. Revenues sagged as output slipped and the shadow economy skimmed. Every ruble promised had fewer goods behind it. That's the quiet definition of insolvency. Not cash today, but the loss of believable tomorrow. Material, the second channel, was physics. Fuel, metals, bearings, tires, alloying elements, medical supplies, finite, interdependent. War diverted them, doubled wear and delayed maintenance. Each temporary transfer shaved margin from somewhere else. Buffers vanished. When the same pump, railcar, or grinder had to perform with less service and more load, failure moved from risk to schedule. You can reschedule paperwork. You can't reschedule a seized bearing. Social, the third channel, was trust turned into compliance. Drafts pulled labor from shop floors, trauma raised absenteeism, black markets rewired incentives. Veterans needed care and jobs, households needed goods and truth. Glasnost delivered truth and exposed rot. The old bargain, except shortages for stability, lost its buyer. Legitimacy is capital. The war spent it. Thread through all three an external account that narrowed. Oil priced the wallet. Sanctions and tech restrictions priced the fixes. Hard currency needs rose as aviation adapted and hospitals modernized. Dollars fell as crude did. The loop closed. Fewer dollars meant more deferral. More deferral meant lower output. Lower output meant fewer dollars. Bankruptcy isn't a cliff, it's a spiral. Map the flows. Fuel to front meant fuel not to factory. A helicopter hour demanded flares, IR kits, engines, each with supply chains that touched foreign catalogs. Those dollars displaced a chemical feedstock delivery that a fertilizer plant needed. Fertilizer shortfalls cut yields. Yields forced grain imports. Imports drained the same currency that avionics called for. Meanwhile, a director paid a fixer for a spare part the plan had already funded, turning single costs into doubles. Multiply that by thousands of decisions, and you see capacity leak like steam. What nobody knew in one room, but everyone felt, was the compounding. Deferred maintenance doesn't add, it multiplies. A pipeline bearing skipped today poisons a compressor tomorrow and shuts a line next quarter. A factory cannibalized this month loses a machine family next year. A hospital short on antibiotics this week sees chronic cases that cost decades. The Afghan campaign didn't invent these multipliers. It accelerated them and synchronized their due dates. So what does bankruptcy mean for a state? Three conditions overlap: capacity loss, credibility loss, and compounding shocks. Lose capacity and planes, rails, and clinics can't meet claims. Lose credibility and prices float in shadows. Taxes thin, orders get negotiated. Add shocks, oil crashes, debt pressures, coup attempts, and the buffers that once absorbed hits are already spent. The ledger still shows assets. The system can't mobilize them. There are echoes elsewhere. France in Algeria bled legitimacy and political cohesion more than cash. The Treasury survived. The Fourth Republic didn't. The United States in Vietnam met a different constraint: political capital, inflation, and a dollar standard strained by guns and butter, then reset by closing the gold window in the early 1970s. Britain after Suez learned that financial sovereignty depends on external confidence. Humiliation wasn't just diplomatic, it was sterling. Each case rides its own rails, but the mechanism rhymes. War reveals that your true budget lives in things: trust, machines, time, not just money. Here's the core lesson, stripped of romance. Systems fail gradually, then all at once, when claims exceed means, and everyone starts acting on that knowledge. The Afghan War pushed claims up and means down while teaching millions to root around the plan. When reform arrived, it found hollow beams and tenants already moving their furniture to the stairs. Bring it back to one last human moment from the ledger it left. A quartermaster stands in a dim warehouse, clipboard under his arm, radio hissing about a unit that needs fuel by dawn. The tank shows low. The manifest says full. He knows the numbers aren't lying. They're describing a world that no longer exists. He signs, he reallocates, he calls a favor. Somewhere, a train gets bumped. Somewhere else, a clinic postpones a surgery for lack of anesthetics. None of them see each other. All of them pay the same bill. The war didn't just drain rubles. It stripped buffers, burned trust, and turned tomorrow's capacity into today's promise. If you want the hidden mechanics behind collapses that look sudden but brew for years, watch the next film, How Currency Confidence Quietly Vanishes. Subscribe to stay with the stories most histories skip, and the decisions that still send invoices long after the shooting stops.